Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Paul's Cinema Picks of the Week. I'm your host, Brantford's film enthusiast, Paul Westbrook. And today, we are celebrating an anniversary. We are doing our 100th episode, and I want to explain a little bit what we're going to be doing. It's going to be a three-parter. Today we're going to be talking about the first decade of cinema. And with that, it's going to be it's sort of like a history lesson in that. The second one, we're going to be talking about different genres and stuff of film and stuff, which will be very interesting because you get to go through different genres like classic, drama, comedy, horror, whatever, all the above. And the third one, we're going to be talking about the VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray video market. And you'll be able to hear about all the Blu-rays and the DVDs and the VHS. Well, it starts with VHS, goes to DVD and then Blu-ray, and so on and so forth. But we'll get into that when the episode comes. But in the meantime, welcome to the first decade of cinema. Yes. And a lot of people think that Hollywood was where a lot of movies started, which is true to a point. Hollywood was where movies became very famous, but the actual film capital of the world at the time was not Hollywood. It was New Jersey. And here's a documentary here. It's called Before Hollywood. Let me know if you're getting this.
Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Yep.
It's called Before Hollywood. There was Fort Lee, New Jersey. Yes. And New Jersey was where a lot of the early film studios. That's where Thomas Alva Edison, who also invented our famous light bulbs, also came up with, in the American version of early cinema, came up with the kinetoscope, and the very first film studio, which was in New Jersey, was called the Black Maria. It was like a small black building and that, but that was to keep the sun out and stuff, and a lot of the early studios started off, like early movie making, when they did in New Jersey, they would start off making these very early experimental or films. And people, at the time, you would have like these little peep show machines. You'd pay like a nickel or whatever, a penny, and you would just look in these little machines, and then you would see like a series of framed pictures, and then it would be rotated into a motion so that hence made motion pictures. But a lot of people also realized that Edward Muybridge, who was an inventor at the time, he came up with the idea of motion for motion pictures when they had a horse, and they wanted to see how long a horse its feet leaves the ground or something like that, if it leaves the ground during motion. So what he did is he and a fellow inventor actually came up with this system where it would show a series of pictures like photographs, and then he would put it into the machine, and as the machine turned, the horse would seem like it was moving. So when it was played really fast, you'd actually see the movement of the animal, and hence how motion pictures came to be as well. My thing is, I always like to credit the French as coming up with the invention of motion pictures, including like Auguste and Louis Lumiere, the Lumiere brothers. Yes, you have to pardon my voice, it's a little hoarse, I was at a show last night. But yeah, the Lumiere brothers, they came up with the cinematograph camera, motion picture camera, and they're actually responsible for the first fully exhibited motion pictures, which took place in Paris, France, although they did take their patented invention all over the world. In fact, one of the very first motion pictures to be exhibited was actually exhibited at the old Madison Square Garden in New York City. And a lot of people may not have known that, but yes, at the time when they were doing these inventions, and films at the time weren't like necessarily for entertainment, they were also for inventiveness purposes. So they would go around and then they would show these films and exhibitions, and usually meeting halls, stuff, just to get the idea what movies were like. But yeah, it all started in the American and Canadian side. It started in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and it's called the Early Movie Making in New Jersey. And a lot of the studios today are no longer in existence because of time, and eventually what happened when they moved to Hollywood. They moved to Hollywood because Edison had this group of men called Trust. It was called the Patent Trust, that they would go around, they'd bully these other filmmakers, break their equipment, and to make them stop making films, because Edison, since he was the inventor of film, that he figured these people were making money off of him, so what he would do is he'd send these people around, they'd destroy equipment, they would wreck as much as possible, and then a lot of people, the inventors and the other filmmakers got tired of it, so they figured, okay, what's a good place we could go to that we'd be free of the trust and we wouldn't have to worry about the weather and the climate and stuff. And then they thought of a place in California, because California had the sun and they had the nice temperatures. Thought it would be perfect for filmmaking, so they moved a lot of operations to California, and that's where the first Hollywood films, at that time called Hollywood Land, and the first Hollywood films were actually made there. And that way Edison, they'd be free of Edison, they'd be free of the trust, they could make the films that they wanted, and a lot of the independents started coming up around that time too. So that's what a little bit of history from this DVD here, and it's also got a few films that were done at the time. Like they have the New York Hat, which featured a very young Mary Pickford. It was made in 1912, which was the year my grandmother was born, by the way. They have a 1917 feature called A Girl's Folly. Then you have 1914's Wishing Well, or The Wishing Ring. There, we got that, and they show different clips. It's not the full versions of the movies, but you have Rescued from an Eagle's Nest and Biographs, The Curtain Pole. And Eagle's Nest was made in 1907, Curtain Pole was 1909. And you get to see a lot of the footage. There's footage in here from 1935 of the Great Glass Studios that are now in ruins, and very sad because that's how the advent of films began. So to see these buildings now in ruin, it's just sad. It's tragic, more or less. But anyway, let's get on to another one here. The Great Train Robbery. You got this one here, sis?
1 second.
Okay, we're just checking to make sure that we're getting...
Yep.
We got The Great Train Robbery. It was made in 1903. And The Great Train Robbery, this is the 100th anniversary special edition, and this was the very first motion picture to tell a complete story. Up to then, movies were usually like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. Those are like the early experimental films, and even Méliès films. Georges Méliès, he was a stage magician who later became a filmmaker himself. I talked about it in previous episodes, and his feature movie, A Trip to the Moon, or Le Voyage dans la Lune, was so close to 5 or 6 minutes or 12 minutes, depending on which version you have, because there were different versions that are out there probably on YouTube. But yeah, this movie here, The Great Train Robbery, was the first one to tell a complete story in its entirety. It was directed by Edward S. Porter, and starred a famous Western star at the time who was called Bronco Billy Anderson. And he's the one that formed the S&A Studios, which Charlie Chaplin joined in 1915 after his Keystone Studios contract ran out. And here, on this one, besides the train robbery, you have William S. Hart and Tom Mix in a couple of movies as well. You've got D.W. Griffith's The Heart of Texas Ryan, which was made in 1916. and that one was the one that featured Tom Mix. Tumbleweeds was the great Western star William S. Hart, and it was actually his last film that he did. And see, you got The Covered Wagon, so worthy of being ranked with The Covered Wagon and The Iron Horse as a major Western epic in itself, because a lot of the movies they put on this are just pretty well Western things. Tumbleweeds, Heart of Texas Ryan, and The Battle of Elderbush Gulch, which was directed by D.W. Griffith. And it had Lillian Gish, who I like to call one of the great cinematic female actresses of her generation, and Mae Marsh, who was famous for a little while, then eventually she went into obscurity, which a lot of the silent film stars did at the time. And it was one of their great Western movies at that time. Okay, now our next one here, Robert Youngson's When Comedy Was King. This is the movie here that features a lot of the classic silent comedians of the time. You have Charlie Chaplin, you have Laurel and Hardy, you have Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, even though he said in an interview once he preferred to be called Roscoe, so we're going to honor his wishes there and call him Roscoe Arbuckle. You have Laurel and Hardy, of course, with James Finlayson, Mabel Normand, you have Charlie Chase, Billy Bevan, Snub Pollard, the Max Sennett Dating Beauties, the girls, they showed a lot of the bikinis when they were in the early silent films for Sennett. Billy Bevan and the famous Keystone Cops in this one. Wallace Beery in a very early role. And Buster Keaton, who in a lot of ways was Charlie Chaplin's rival. And of course, no silent film collection can be complete without the master of comedy himself, Charlie Chaplin. My personal favorite, so it might be a little bit biased here, but yeah. To me, Chaplin was the silent film king. And you have Harry Langdon in here. He was a silent film actor that wanted to be on par with Chaplin, and he worked with Frank Capra for a lot of the early films that he did, but he wanted to branch out on his own, and the problem was he was created by the studio. The character that he portrayed of the baby-faced comedian was created by the studio, so by the time he went on his own, he realized that his career was starting to falter because he wasn't able to maintain a lot of the comedic timing that he had, and he didn't do very well, and eventually he faded into obscurity like so many silent comedians did at the time, because a lot of them didn't adapt to the talking when talking started, and they would be tested, and many of their voices were hampered by accents, or they were hampered by a high pitch, and as a result of that, a lot of the silent comedians all of a sudden found themselves out of work and weren't able to continue in film. While many of them actually were able to continue in films. Chaplin himself actually resisted the talking films for many years. He thought talking was a fad and it was just something that was going to be here and then gone. And he also thought that it would ruin his art of pantomime, because Chaplin's reliability was on the art of pantomime. Pardon me, I have to take a drink here. Chaplin relied on an art of pantomime in many of his films, and it's how his films became more expressive, and in many ways they blended the elements of dramatic film as well as comedy, so you had a blending of pathos and laughter at the same time, which were actually very good for his art. And Laurel and Hardy actually got to be in talking films themselves, because once they finished doing silent movies, they transitioned very well into talkies, and I think they did extremely well. And Arbuckle was great. He did a few talkies, but the thing that hampered him was the scandal that he was in. I don't really want to get into all that, but yeah, he was in a scandal in the 20s, which basically ended his career. And as a result of that, he was blacklisted for many years. So even though he was proven innocent of any charges that he had undergone, in the public's eye, he was already guilty, so he spent the rest of his life making small appearances in talking films under a name, Frank Goodish, and he died in obscurity years later, and it was, again, one of the very tragic and sad times in the history of cinema. Now, for our third one here, we have the 1922 classic film by F.W. Murnau. Friedrich Murnau did a film called Nosferatu. And my sister can get that there. You got it? Good. And Nosferatu was one of the very first renditions, if not the first, film adaptation of Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, what happened here is a lot of the prints of this film were lost or destroyed, and I'll explain that. At the time they made Nosferatu, apparently they didn't get the copyrights from Stoker's widow. So at the time when they filmed Nosferatu, when she found out, she wanted all the prints destroyed and everything. That she took them to court over it. It was like a whole copyright issue for years. But obviously, I'm holding the film here. Nosferatu survived and became one of the benchmarks in German expressionist horror films. And Max Schreck, who plays the character, plays it so well. Instead of playing Dracula as the suave, debonair type lover, romantic lover, here he's played like a creature of filth and dread. And I remember seeing the movie when I was very little. When I saw it the first time, I saw it on a clip, and it was so frightening, and that I just shut the TV off right there. And I think I had nightmares for a week. But today I can actually say I own a copy of the film, and it's certainly one of the cinematic masterpieces of the 20th century. Last but not least, we come to the talkie era. Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer, yes, which has been remade several times, including the one by Neil Diamond that my friend Dave there. So Dave, I'm giving you a prop there.
There you go.
Yeah, he told me about the remake with Neil Diamond. Yes, this is the original 1927 production, 26-27 production with Al Jolson, the one where he sings "Memmy," and you ain't heard nothing yet. Yes, and this is an excellent set. I might have mentioned it on a silent film before.
Not that I can remember.
Not that I can remember. Maybe you might have to see some of the past episodes to take a look. But yes, this Jazz Singer set comes complete with the movie itself. You get vintage short films. You get a radio show adaptation and a movie trailer gallery, which is fun. And then classic homage cartoons. I love to sing on, which today would a lot of the politically correct people today wouldn't like, because it actually shows people in blackface, and today that's considered racial. So it's definitely a collector's item if you have seen this film or wanted to own a copy of it, and this is a really good set to get of it. This too, we talk about the early sound era, because now we're getting into the talking parts of the film. And it has a feature-length documentary, The Dawn of Sound, how the movies learned to talk. And Theodore Chase, and he was an inventor, he did a lot of these experimental films about learning to make the films talk. And then you also have movies like Surviving Sound excerpts from the 1929 Gold Diggers of Broadway, studio shorts, and celebrating the early sound era. Because after a while, silent movies got to the point by the mid-20s where people had pretty well seen everything. They wanted the next fad, and it was the Warner Brothers themselves that actually came up with the idea of getting the creative license to do with the Jazz Singer. And sadly, Sam Warner, who was one of the famed Warner brothers, he passed away just prior to the film's release. So he had worked so hard to make this film, along with the other Warner brothers, but the problem is when he got sick and then he passed away, he never really got to see his life's work. But it was dedicated to him all just the same, and to this day we have the film that actually speaks for itself, and as they say, you haven't heard anything yet, because it was one of the really heavy benchmark films that brought in through the talkie era. From then on, movies actually would play silent, like this one here. It has silent, it's mostly a silent film, but there are little scenes where you actually hear the person's voice for the first time, and that was through the phonographs, like they played it like a record. In fact, the discs in here are very similar to the recording device that they played at the time, and you hear the voice, and then they had the mechanism to make the voice in sync with the picture frame, so you'd be able to see the film and you'd be able to hear it at the same time. And that's what made this movie really special, the fact that it's the first full-length talking film. Although a lot of people would say that the next year that the all-talking film, which was Broadway Melody, which was made in 1928, that was the one that had all talking for the whole film. There was no silent thing whatsoever. So that's a little bit of a journey through the first decade of film. And if you can find any of these films at your video store or
Amazon,
order it. If you want to see anything, yes, Amazon's the perfect way to get a lot of obscure films, because a lot of the stores, there's some movies that they don't sell in stores, so you have to get it through Amazon, or you can go to a store, they'll order it for you, and you'll enjoy it that way. But we want to thank you for listening to Part 1, the first decade of film, and reminding you to like and subscribe to the channel, send a comment just below the video, and thank you very much for listening. Be ready for Part 2 coming up next week, and I'll be seeing you at the movies. Bye for now.